Hello everyone and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey. I'm the Executive Director of APA Ohio and Vice Chair of the New Urbanism Division. I will be the moderator for today's webcast. Today, Friday, October 4th, we will hear the presentation, Calculating Developer Contributions. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen or call the 1-800 number shown. For content questions related to the presentation, type those in the questions box also located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. On your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions. I would like to thank all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible. Today's webcast is sponsored by the Urban Design and Preservation Division. For more information on this division and how to become a member, you can visit planning.org/division/urban design. And we'll also hear a little bit more about the division shortly. And you can learn more about all of our divisions by visiting planning.org/divisions. On your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. To register for these webcasts, visit www.utah-apa.org/webcasts. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, visit planning.org/CM. Select today's date and today's webcast. This webcast will be available for 1.5 CM credits. Of course, like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on the Planning Webcast Series sponsored by our chapters and divisions. We are recording today's webcast and it will be available on our YouTube channel later today. Search Planning Webcast on YouTube. A PDF of the PowerPoint is also available upon request. I'd now like to turn it over to Margaret. She is the Webcast Chair Coordinator for the Urban Design and Preservation Division, and she is going to talk a little bit about Urban Design and Preservation Division, and she will introduce our speakers. Margaret.
Thank you, Christine. Welcome, everyone. I'm Margaret Rifkin, as Christine said, with the Urban Design and Preservation Division. In addition to today's webinar, our division is also sponsoring one on Designing Suburban Futures with June Williamson on November 1st, and one on Making Cities Walkable with Jeff Speck on November 8th. We hope you will enjoy all our division's webinars. This is the second of 4 we're offering this year. And we also hope you will join the Urban Design and Preservation Division so you can be part of our national network of placemakers from a variety of disciplines. We're sponsoring the webinar today on calculating developer contributions because all our great ideas about design and preservation and placemaking require implementation strategies that are fair and reasonable. With that, I'm delighted to present our 2 speakers today. First, my friend Carl Moritz, who serves the City of Alexandria, Virginia, as the Deputy Director for Long Range and Strategic Planning. He has over 25 years of experience working in planning in the Washington, D.C. area. His current responsibilities in Alexandria include neighborhood planning, community development, demographics, and forecasting. And he is also great at explaining things very well in simple terms, as you will see. Our next panelist is Sarah Woodworth, who is a managing member of WZHA, which is a highly regarded national real estate advisory firm. Ms. Woodworth specializes in urban redevelopment and transit-oriented development. Her broad expertise includes market analysis, development feasibility, innovative financing techniques, and public-private deal structuring. With that, it's my pleasure to welcome Carl and Sarah.
Thank you very much. I want to first thank Christine and Margaret for inviting us to speak to you today. The focus of this session, let's see, Sure, it's okay. The focus of this session is the value that's created when a community agrees to allow additional development on a parcel or in a neighborhood. So this might be when a development project is approved, or a parcel is rezoned, or a new master plan is adopted. Really, by a stroke of a pen, then the government is acting on behalf, increases the value of private land by saying it can be developed more intensively today than it was yesterday. Sarah and I are going to argue that understanding the value that's created this way is a very important tool for planners to have. You might use this information when negotiating for developer-funded improvements, and we'll show you how to do that. But I think you'll also see that it can be helpful even if you have very limited ability to ask for developer contributions, because it helps you determine if you are proposing the right densities, to determine if the plans are implementable, and also to achieve greater buy-in from the community. So I'm going to provide an introduction and the planner's perspective. Sarah Woodworth will walk you through the process and illustrate important concepts. And then I'm going to touch base on a few legal perspectives and then how all this works with phase development, which is a very important part of it. Excuse me there. So a community is considering a rezoning or preparing a plan that will add some density and possibly create additional demand on transportation, public safety, and other services. And maybe there are community members who want to know a couple of things. Is all that additional density necessary, and why will improving that density benefit them? Two questions certainly that I hear a lot. So a value capture is typically thought of as a set of tools that capture some of the increase in value on private land that's created by government action. And in Tyson's Corner, Virginia, it's being used to help pay for $5.2 billion Metro Rail extension to Dulles Airport. In Montgomery County, Maryland, it's generating about $280 million to pay for transportation and other improvements to support transit-oriented development near the White Flint Metro Station. Some of the methods that are used to capture the value are tools that capture increases to the tax base, whether it's a formal tax increment financing district or something less formal, where the city might anticipate increased tax revenues and make sure that that's enough to cover the increased payments that they might need to make. Some other more structured methods are special assessment districts and impact fees, and of course any contributions that a developer agrees to make as a condition of approval would count as well. In Alexandria, we've been a little obsessed with this issue of value because we have a comparatively high market demand for new development, a fairly strong ability to get developer contributions, and a community that has very high expectations that we're going to bargain hard on their behalf. So what this has led us to do is include a financial plan as part of every small area plan. That financial plan shows what infrastructure and amenities are needed, what they cost, and how we're going to pay for them, usually a combination of developer contributions, an informal tax increment financing district, and the general fund. I think the most important outcome of it is that the community has a real sense that they're going to get what is promised. Some of the questions that you can answer when you know the value that's being created by the plan is, one, if we cut back on the density that the developer is requesting, is that redevelopment still possible? If we double the density, will that be enough to encourage redevelopment? Is the additional density an effective incentive for asking developers to provide affordable housing? Can we ask for underground parking, or will the cost doom the project? And can we pay for a transit line with the value that's created by upzoning the station areas? I'm going to take you through a couple of examples in Alexandria that shows you what I mean. And this is about the Braddock Master Plan, and it involved redevelopment of a large public housing project as well as industrial uses that surround a Metro Rail station. What we needed to do was provide enough density to add both market rate housing but also replace all of the public housing. And what the community wanted was a new 1-acre park, and we wanted development to pay for half of that park. And we were able to show that this would work, and the redevelopment of both the public housing and the park is underway. The second one I want to talk to you about is North Potomac Yard, where we're planning for the replacement of a large, very successful strip shopping center into a multimodal mixed-use community of approximately 7.5 million square feet. This is a prime location just south of Reagan National Airport, but to make all of that density work, we needed to add a new inline metro station. And the question was whether the increase in value from the development would be enough to pay for the new metro station as well as some of the other important amenities such as parks and the site of a new elementary school. And the analysis showed that the increased FAR allows about $240 million in land value increase for the property owner, which is something that we could tap into. The next example that I have is a landmark plan, which is focused on redeveloping a failing mall as well as a lot of older strip commercial that is between the mall, which is at the north end there, and then the metro station, which is the south of that map. To make this happen, we added about 12 million square feet in development potential, and here the question was whether the economics would allow this project to happen at all, let alone contribute to the bus rapid transit project we have planned. So what we decided with Sarah's help was that we would not expect developer contributions from the early redevelopment projects. We called this the catalyst phase, and we felt these early developers were taking the most risk. Later, after a critical mass of redevelopment takes place, which we estimated about 2 million square feet, we felt that second phase of development would have an increased ability to pay some developer contributions, not a huge amount, but something toward that transit project. The last phase of this plan is when the transit is in place, which in and of itself will add value to the sites in the plan and make redevelopment less risky. So in that phase, we'd expect the highest level of contributions from new development. The last one I want to mention is an area called the Beauregard Corridor, and Sarah was also very involved in this plan. It contains a lot of older multifamily garden and high-rise apartments, a few smaller single-family detached houses. Those gardens were built in the 60s and 70s, originally for singles coming to the Washington area, but over time they became more and more attractive to low-income families. So as a result, a big objective of this plan was to maximize affordable housing. At the same time, we have a lot of transportation challenges here, and so we needed some money for that. We also wanted in addition to a new transit line, we wanted a fire station, and we wanted some parkland. So there was quite a long shopping list of things that we were hoping to pay for with this plan. An interesting element of the plan was that there were 5 main landowners, and they decided, all of which were developers. So they had in mind something specific that they wanted to do, but also they decided to negotiate with the city as a group. So whatever developer contribution was agreed to, they were going to divide it up among them, sort of pro rata. We were able to make all of this work, get everything on our list, even getting 800 units of affordable housing, in part by phasing the developer contributions over time and in injecting some public money at key points. Phasing is an important tool to making all this work, and I'm going to talk about that at the end of this presentation, in part because early money is the most expensive money that there is. When we're working with developers and negotiating a contribution, a big issue is what counts as a quote-unquote contribution and what doesn't. We came up with a term which is we call the bucket, which describes the list of things that count as a developer contribution. The things quote-unquote in the bucket are things over and above the basic things that any developer would be required to do, like handling stormwater or providing the minimum amount of open space. It's an important issue because we, that is the government, want to make sure that the bucket list only contains things that are truly extra. We figure if it's something that we routinely ask for, something that the ordinance requires, things that any developer would have to do, even if they don't get an increase in density, then the developer should have known we would ask for it and they should have built it into their original pro forma. But we recognize that there isn't a bright line between what is in the bucket and what's a standard requirement. And a good example of that might be underground parking. In Alexandria, it's something that we nearly always ask for, but the developers nearly always want it counted as an extra cost that is put on this bucket list. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, and she's going to talk to us about calculating the developer contribution. And here we go.
Thanks, Carl. Hi, I'm Sarah Woodworth, and work for a consulting firm that basically deals with market economics and public-private finance. So we inform the planning process by addressing questions like, does the policy make sense from a market standpoint? Would private investors implement the policy in the foreseeable future? What benefits accrue to the private sector as a result of the policy, and can we translate any benefit into community investments? And that's what we do, and we work with both the public and the private sector. Getting to the next page. Sorry. So why engage the market and economic perspective in the planning process? As you will see in the following examples, one reason is to understand how much the private sector can potentially pay towards implementing the plan. But even before this, to inform the community during the planning process as to what the market and economic implications are under different policy initiatives. For example, I'm currently working with a jurisdiction in Connecticut where they spent a great deal of time adopting a village commercial district zone. It's a new zoning initiative, and the zone allows for reduced setbacks, relaxed parking requirements, all to encourage good design and good development consistent with a village character. The zone, however, allows for only 3-story heights. And when we look at existing land values in these village commercial districts, it will be very difficult for 3-story redevelopment to happen because it won't be financially feasible. If they had considered the economics as part of the planning process, I wonder whether the community would have accepted a 4-story rather than a 3-story limit, knowing the economics of redevelopment. So our basic concept as it relates to rezoning, and really what I mean by that is upzoning, is in some cases, by the stroke of a regulatory pen, private property owners can obtain a lot of new value without doing a thing. And our contention is that under these types of circumstances, the community should participate in that benefit. And here's my example on the table. Is under existing zoning, a given property owner has the ability to develop 15 dwelling units, and the market is willing to pay for land to the tune of $25,000 a dwelling unit. That means that property owner's land is worth, with a 15-unit zoning, $375,000. Well, under new zoning, the community decides that they think that it's okay to have upzone, and they will allow 55 units on the same parcel. Well, assuming that they can still get $25,000 a unit in land value, that property owner's value just went to $1.375 million, which means there was a $1 million benefit as a result of that rezoning. Our contention is we should get a piece of that. Now, there's a couple of things to take into consideration, and while this may seem obvious, what's amazing is how often it happens in the real world, is that zoning does not necessarily create market. Just because you rezone and upzone does not necessarily mean that that level of development will happen. You have to consider whether there is market support for that level of upzoning. So in this example, while we may have upzoned it to 55 units, the market is only able to absorb 15 units in the foreseeable future. So in fact, the upzoning doesn't create near-term value to that landowner. They're basically in the same place. Now, maybe over the long term when market conditions change, but when we're working on these things, we're trying to think of how we're going to pay for near-term or mid-term infrastructure. So you have to always really consider the true market realities facing redevelopment in your area when you're trying to value the benefit of your zoning initiatives. Another important consideration is that often with intensification of land use comes additional cost. So, and that will then reduce sometimes the economic benefit of increased density. So in this case, to get the 55 units on this particular site, the developer or the owner would have to provide structured parking. And structured parking costs $20,000 a space, let's say. And if the rents are the same between the 15 units and the 55 units, that $20,000 comes right out of their land value. So in fact, the highest and best use for this piece of property isn't the 55 units where the land value would be $275,000, but in fact, the 15 units with surface parking, which would have a land value of $375,000. We need to be considering cost, and I can say that this happens a lot in real life with strip centers. People think that you can just structure parking and add density, and that necessarily makes a better project, and that is not always the case. So in terms of examples, we thought it would be helpful to run through
Sarah,
some
can I
of
just
our
interrupt you?
real-life examples in terms of time.
Can I just interrupt
Yes.
you? I'm sorry. When you get that funky pop-up, if you select the bottom option, it'll go away permanently.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
I thought I was just seeing that.
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Thanks.
As you know, the Beauregard planning process was in Alexandria, Virginia. There was near-term market for higher density land uses, and there were a select group, 5, of large landowners in the planning area. To accommodate the density, however, required investments in road, utilities, transit, and other public amenities. And as Carl mentioned, the City of Fairfax's policy is that each approved plan must have a financing plan to show that it is feasible. So the question at hand was, what benefits accrue to the property owners if the city allows for more density, and how much can we expect the private sector to contribute towards the implementation of the plan? And then ultimately, with that knowledge, can this plan be financed? So the first thing we do in every case is pretty basic. We understand what current land values are, and we do this by working closely with the city appraiser. They often are really on top of what developers are paying for land for different kinds of land uses. In this case, this example is just one property owner in the Beauregard planning area, and they currently had zoning for 878 units, and we identified that developers were willing to pay $45,000 to $55,000 for land per unit in Beauregard at the time. So that means that the current value of the project, of the land, was between $39.5 and $48.29 million, and that's their current value. So we then look, the second step is to calculate the value with the new zoning. This is pretty basic. Our new zoning suggested that the same piece of property, we would allow it to accommodate 1,472 units. Notice that our values are not 45 to 55,000, but we assumed that we would get a 5% bump because what is being planned in Beauregard includes transit and a high degree of public amenities. So we bumped the land values to reflect the benefits of a good plan and more of a transit orientation. So with that, that property owner under the new plan would ultimately have a value of between $69.6 million and $85 million for their land. Then we calculate the difference. And so what their existing land from their rezoned land value, and we get a range of between $30 and $35.7 million. We do this for each of the landowners in Beauregard. This is what we did, and we basically gave the city a great big range of potential benefits to the private sector. What the city then does is negotiate, and it's a very transparent process. We show them our logic. It's quite intuitive. This isn't detailed pro forma and a lot of nitty-gritty details. This is intuitively, this is what we think the benefit is to you. Now let's negotiate what is an equitable financing arrangement between the public and private sector to make this plan workable and feasible. And as a result of negotiation, the developers, and as Carl mentioned, they actually negotiated as a group. We came to an agreement that they would pay a certain amount of money for every foot developed, square foot developed, that money would be contributed towards fire stations, transit, parks. and they pay that money at the time of their approval. So that's Beauregard. Carl also mentioned North Potomac Yard, which is also in Alexandria. The issue with North Potomac Yard, if you look at the aerial, you can see the rail line on the right side, which is the east, and then you also can see that there's a river over there, which is the Potomac River. This is a super valuable site that everyone would love to have a metro station, and for those of you who are not from the Washington, D.C. area, Metro is our regional transit operator, and basically land around those metro stations is very valuable. So the question there in the case of Potomac was, how do you help to get the developer to pay for the metro station when it is likely it will probably be at least a decade before that metro station happens? And we also have a very valuable power center sitting on top, 600,000 square foot retail power center. So what we did is we did the same kind of process, and we looked at what is the existing power center's land value. And we came up, once again, working closely with the city's appraiser, with $90 million. A footnote here is we rarely, when we're doing these kinds of calculations, underestimate current land value. It's a very bad way to start a negotiation, is to undervalue a property owner's existing property. So we tend to be fairly lenient on land value, and in this case we came up with a base value of $90 million. We then, as we did in Beauregard, calculated new value with new zoning. Now, in the case of Potomac Yard, it was fairly complicated simply because the city was not going to allow super high density of use without transit, and land values were going to be very different with and without transit. So we looked at a variety of development scenarios, one with lower density and without metro, another with higher density with metro, and we understood the economic implications of those on land values. And as you can see, land value clearly improves with office and residential, with metro, and with density, because you start getting views and you get the transit premium. So we then, as we did in the others, we calculated the difference. On the left side, where we have 1.5 floor area ratio with no metro station, the developer would be able to get about $72.5 million of net new land value by just increasing his density from a 0.2 to a 1.5. In the case of with metro and a higher density, that developer would get almost $241 million of net new land value as a result of that policy. So that's a wide range of land value enhancement. So the city took that, and they negotiated a deal wherein it was resolved that the developer, who was very interested, obviously, in getting that metro station and helping to pay for it because there will be great benefit to their bottom line, they agreed to a special assessment in the near term and a lower 1.5 floor area ratio, intensity of use zoning, and they would pay on a per square foot basis each time something was redeveloped under this lower zoning envelope while we waited for the metro station. Then, when a metro station came, the zoning envelope would go up. It would step up to 2.5 FAR because now we've got some mode shift, and they would pay a higher premium per square foot to help to pay for implementing the plan. So Potomac is a fairly complex solution, but it was a way for the city to continue to capture value as conditions changed over time. Sorry. White Flint, which Carl mentioned in his introduction, is in actually Montgomery County, Maryland. It is an area that is right off of the Washington, D.C. Beltway. It's very sort of typical commercial strip, but very, very productive from an economic perspective. In other words, land is very valuable here. Even though it's very low density and it doesn't look great, it's very valuable land. Montgomery County began a planning process for this part of the county, White Flint, and it was recognized that the residents of the community were super suspect of density because in the past, as redevelopment happens and land uses were intensified, the infrastructure did not keep up with it, and their whole quality of life was compromised due to traffic and congestion. The landowners in White Flint recognized this issue that the community may be very interested in trying to create a mixed-use walkable environment, but may want to limit density because of their fear of more congestion and more traffic. So the landowners in White Flint created basically a consortium. They retained our firm to try and educate the community about land use economics and redevelopment economics, and tried to find a public-private solution that would allow infrastructure to be built in front of density to address the community's concerns with regard to that issue. So what we did is we, just as we did in the other process, but this time working for the private landowners and not the city or the community, is the private property owners illustrated to the community what existing property values are in White Flint at the time that this planning process was being undertaken. And the idea was the property values were very, very high. And for those of you who aren't super familiar with floor area ratio, I created this little exhibit on the left-hand side of the slide. Let's just go over it really quickly. It's a fairly basic concept, but if you don't get it, it's going to be hard to understand this, this example. Let's just say we had a 40,000 square foot piece of dirt, and that piece of dirt was worth $6.8 million in the marketplace. And let's say we had a zoning code that allowed for a, quote, 2.0 FAR. What that means is the zoning allows us to do 2 times the amount of the land area, or 80,000 square feet, of development. The value then of the parcel with a 2.0 FAR is $6.8 million divided by 80,000 square feet, and that is an $85 FAR foot. And the same thing goes, if it were a 3 FAR, you divide the $6.8 million by 120,000, and that gives you a $57 per FAR foot land value. So that's what that all means. So in the case of White Flint, the private sector demonstrated to the community, this is what's happening out there, here are our land values. It's on the ground. A developer would not sell or redevelop their property without getting at least that kind of money per FAR foot, because it would not be in their economic best interest. We then understood the land values of existing uses in the marketplace under these different floor area ratio scenarios. And you can see this project was done during the go-go years, right before the Great Recession, when condos were very hot and multifamily rental wasn't. But you can see that what we illustrated to them was, here are our market realities. Note, by the way, that the rental residential retail mix has a negative $1.97 per FAR foot. That's because the costs of going up and structured parking were such that it didn't make any sense to actually develop that kind of a land use on the land. There would be no land value in that scenario. But we presented this to the community, and then we illustrated, if we have to get on the top line at a 2 FAR, we have to get $85 for a developer to sell or redevelop the land. At a 3 FAR, we have to get $57, and at a 4 FAR, we have to get $43 to sell or redevelop the land. Only with the higher density would there be, in the case of a condominium or an office retail mix, the economic justification for redevelopment. If they didn't get enough density, in other words, the land uses would stay as they are today. And they certainly wouldn't be a walkable mixed-use environment that the community wanted. What ended up happening in the case of White Flint is the community absolutely grasped this. They want the mixed-use walkable environment, but they were concerned still about, you're going to build it and then the infrastructure is not going to get here and we're going to be in a terrible environment, and that's not what we want. The property owners agreed as part of this planning process and as part of the financing plan of the White Flint sector plan that they would create a special assessment district and they would pay extra taxes that would go towards infrastructure improvements in the White Flint planning area. And that is being implemented today. So lessons learned. I know many of you already do this in your communities, but there still are many communities that do not. The market and economic perspective should be shared as part of the planning process to understand trade-offs and to allow communities to make informed decisions. We are seeing this more and more as resources remain limited in the public sector, is that plans should be developed with a true understanding of how they will be paid for. It manages expectations, and it generally creates a win-win because plans actually get implemented because they can. And it seems unfortunate in our mind that communities upzone well before the market is ripe for that kind of upzoning. And in our opinion, the opportunities for public-private financing are limited in the situation where you're way ahead of the market and you create too much zoning envelope, and you basically lose your opportunity to leverage private money. And finally, we always recommend to our clients that they really think through and calculate the implications of the various regulations that they impose on the private development community and how that really does impact development costs. Sometimes it can be a real eye-opener, and what it forces communities to do is really prioritize what they want and to reduce the burden on the private sector to allow private investment to occur and growth to happen. So with that, I will turn this back over to Carl.
All right. Thank you very much, Sarah. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the legal parameters and some of the issues from the developer's perspective. Of course, they're the other partner in this, and so we wanted to give you a sense first of how we're able to accomplish this from a legal perspective, and then also some of the points that developers routinely raise with us when we're working with them on this. In Virginia, we have enabling legislation that allows us to engage in proffered rezonings and conditional use permits. And in Alexandria specifically, most of our rezonings occur through the small area planning process, but we do have some standalone rezonings from time to time. Almost every development project in Alexandria that is not by right, and most are not, requires some special use permit of some kind, even if there isn't a rezoning. So that means that the opportunity is almost always there to negotiate for some kind of contribution. They are, of course, considered voluntary in the sense that the developer is asking for something above what he can do by right, and so, and I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of rational nexus. The 3 points here under the voluntary heading says that what the city is asking for must be related to the development and its impact. Proffers are oriented toward facilities and amenities that benefit the development itself or the nearby community, and they do provide the opportunity for a number of different developers to contribute to a project that no single developer could afford. These are the typical categories of projects that can be funded with proffers, and this list was from the perspective of a developer. This might be, he might consider all of these things to be quote unquote in the bucket, or things that are extraordinary contributions But as a city planner, I would say that almost all of these are ones where there's sort of a gray line, that there's some element of these that are things we routinely require and some element of these that might be considered extra. For example, under the green building standards, we do have a green building policy, and that has the expectation of LEED Silver. But if a developer were to do LEED Platinum, then that extra cost would be something that the developer would proffer. These are a few points that we routinely hear from the developers that are important to them, and as a city planner, I completely agree with those. We have found it better for everyone concerned if we work out these expectations early, that we take that opportunity to make choices, to set priorities, as Sarah just mentioned, and that our expectations are rational. Doesn't hurt. And then finally, to stick to these. If we're negotiating in good faith with the development community and the community is joined in with us in those negotiations, we need to stick to what we agreed to. The key point here from the developer's perspective is the same one that Sarah also raised, and I left this slide in even though Sarah made the point very well, is because how often this point is misunderstood. And so many times in my career, public officials in the community routinely assumed that just by adding development potential to a site, they're automatically increasing the value, and also that necessarily we're going to get the maximum amount of development that the zone allows. So if we allow somebody to build to a 3.0 FAR, then they will. And that is a false assumption to make from a variety of perspectives, and you can just look at all the land zoned one thing that's built to less than that development potential all around the country to see that that's the case. The last thing that I want to talk about is development phasing, and I touched on this at the beginning, just how important it is to use the fact that development is phased over time, to recognize first that development is phased over time, and then perhaps to use that as part of your financing strategy. So sometimes we have to get a little creative when we're figuring out how to make sure that the funding resources are going to be enough to pay for everything we need to support a plan. And I mentioned earlier that early money is expensive. It's hard for developers to come up with upfront cash, and easier for them if we wait till some part of the development is built and they're getting some revenue. We also know that over time the increased tax revenues from new development can be substantial, but it takes a while for those increased tax revenues to add up to something that's useful. The city can use its bonding authority to pay for some things earlier, but there's also a limit on how much we can bond. Illustrated on this slide are 3 categories of things that we typically finance this way, and then the first one is a fire station, and it represents things that need to be provided early, either before or very soon after the development project is open. Other examples in this category could include transportation and water and sewer facilities, and sometimes schools are also included in this category. The center picture represents parks and other facilities that are not as urgent. We might be able to wait a little bit for the new park, particularly if it's going to be used primarily by the residents of the new development. And then the third picture is supposed to represent affordable housing, and it's in a category all its own because we have needed a lot of flexibility to make our affordable housing goals happen. It's so expensive to provide it, and it's so needed that we have found ways that we need to add it in gradually over time from the cash flow, as the cash flow from new development increases. So I have 2 examples of how this works, and the first one is from our Beauregard plan that Sarah also talked about. The red line on the chart is supposed to show, or what it does show you, is what the increased tax revenue to the city is expected to be if the development proceeds as expected, as the phasing expected. And you can see that it gets to be quite significant over the course of the 30 or so year build out of the plan. What the red dots are symbolizing is the desired timeframes for the delivery of some of the most key elements of the public amenities, benefits, and infrastructure. So those included a fire station, the affordable housing, a new transitway, an athletic field and recreation enhancements, and the ellipse is a roadway improvement. So the red dots are when we wanted those things to take place if money were no object. But the blue dots are what we had to delay in order to make them line up with the revenue potential, both on the public and the private sector, that we could reasonably expect. So the fire station had to be delayed a couple of years. The affordable housing, approximately 5 years, and the same with the athletic fields and recreation facilities. If you look closely at that red line, that's the tax revenues, you'll see that it dips negative very early on, and that's because we found in this case we needed to actually provide some public money up front to make, it was actually for the affordable housing contribution. So we're actually making an investment in the very early years up front in order to make the whole thing work. The second example is with our Potomac Yard Metro Station, and this is approximately $250 million to $300 million, which is a huge amount of money for a city of 150,000 population to absorb. So it's a big question. If the city were to go ahead, pull the trigger on this project and borrow the amount of money for this, how are we going to pay for the debt service, which here is estimated to be about $15 million a year. So our funding sources, potential funding sources for this included the upfront developer contributions, a special taxing district over the new development, and then the net increases of tax revenues to the city from the new development. And what this graph illustrates is that if the development occurs according to schedule, it isn't until about 7 years in that the revenues are sufficient to cover the debt service. And then after that, we're going to be okay. And that's, of course, assuming that development proceeds on schedule, and that's a big assumption. So it's likely that we're not going to pull the trigger on starting the metro station until we know that at least a critical amount of that development is going to be underway. The last slide before we open to questions is I want to mention the importance of involving the community and how we involve the community along the way. Of course, with a small area plan, we start involving the community very early in their vision and goals for an area, and we don't bring up economics right away. Because in part, we don't want to give the impression that that the planning effort is being driven by economics, and it's not that. It's just because there are a lot of other issues that are important to the community: transportation, the environment, recreation, schools, community character, all of that. But just as we do traffic studies to test whether various development scenarios are feasible from a transportation point of view, we also test these development scenarios from an economic and financial point of view, and to make sure that it works. And then if it does, how much value is created. So I think as Sarah alluded to, once we and the developers agree on an amount, we are very much involving the community in determining what improvements that money is going to be spent on. And we routinely hear from the developers that within reason, they're not as concerned about what the money gets spent on. Of course, it has to be an actual benefit and not something that's arbitrary. It has to be something that benefits the community that surrounds the development and the development itself. But within that framework, they're very willing to let the community have a very strong voice in determining what's on that list of things that gets improved or gets paid for, and the order. So that's a really positive conversation to have with the community, to say, you know, we have X millions of dollars. What do you want to see that spent on? And part of the reason why it's a positive conversation is that they see in a very tangible way that their neighborhood is going to be benefiting from the new development, and that there's some commitment to make that happen. So although the title of this session is Calculating Developer Contributions, I think the message we've been trying to convey is that there's true value in conducting these financial analyses as part of your long-range planning, even if you aren't going to use that information to estimate developer contributions. When the community and the developer agree on the general financial parameters of a plan, it immediately moves the conversation toward more productive topics. And in the end, my experience is that it helps get the plan approved, and even more important, helps ensure that the plan will ultimately be implemented. And with that, I'd be happy to turn it over and have questions.
There, oh, good. There we go. Okay. I was having trouble unmuting myself. Okay, great. That scared me. Thank you, Carl, and thank you, Sarah. This is wonderful. This is a really great breakdown on something that's somewhat complicated. Okay, so we do have some questions coming in, which is really great. So we can just go ahead and jump right into those. I am going to put up my finished slide for those folks who jumped in towards the end. There we go. And also, just as a quick note before we begin the Q&A, this is approved, well, it's pending approved for 1.5 CM credits, and it should be listed within the next week or so. So don't worry if you can't seem to find it now. It's not you. It's just that it has not been posted yet. So please be sure to check back in a week so that you can log those CMs. Okay, let's jump into these Q&As. All right, the first question. In Seattle, we have a park located over a water reservoir by permit, not easement. How can you assign a value to the permit?
Say it again. I mean, you have a park. Who has the permit?
I can't tell you. I'm not quite sure. Whoever asked that question, I guess if they can maybe clarify a little bit more in the question box. I assume it's the city of Seattle.
Okay. Well, if it's a publicly owned reservoir and it's a public park, there isn't a value being generated by the park itself on the reservoir, I wouldn't think. Sarah, you can jump in. Where there might be a potential for this kind of thing is if the park itself is creating value to adjacent private property that isn't there without the park, and that we might be able to calculate, we might be able to use this tool to calculate the benefit to the surrounding private land of having a park adjacent to it rather than a reservoir. Sarah, can you think of something else to add?
I think that's exactly right. I think the park itself doesn't have private development value because it's a park. But we do know that the park does inure benefits to its adjacent properties. I mean, there have been studies on that, and so we could calculate that.
Great. Okay, the next question. What do you do to counteract the feeling of entitlement by the developers when property is downzoned?
That's a tough one.
Yes.
I actually don't have a whole lot of experience in downzoning. I do know that it is very difficult, and you could use this particular methodology. The developer could use it to say you've just taken away a lot of value. That's assuming that there is market to fill up his existing zoning envelope. And we could always, if that isn't the case, then you would calculate whether indeed there really is any difference between the current zoning and the downzoning.
Yeah, as a planner, I guess one thing I would do if I were doing the downzoning is first do it as part of a comprehensive planning effort so that I could go back to the public policy objectives that we were trying to achieve so that no individual developer could make the claim that we were doing this arbitrarily. The second thing I might do is, if I were to hire Sarah to help me with this, is to ask her to help me demonstrate that there wasn't a market demand for the downzone, for the current zoning, so that the downzoning didn't represent a loss in value. An actual loss in value, only a theoretical loss in value. if that were the case. It would have to be true, of course.
And of course, if there is a situation wherein this would be kind of innovative, but you could downzone but allow the developer to sell the development rights of the rights he lost to some other part of town that had market. I mean, that would be another interesting way of dealing with it. So if there were indeed market.
Yeah, and this would be a way to help figure out, well, just how much should he be compensated, the developer be compensated through whether or not you use that information ultimately in your transfer development rights program or not. It might be helpful to know.
Okay. For parklands, was that a transfer of development rights or payment in lieu? I think, Carl, I think that's for you.
Okay. In the Braddock plan, it was actually developer contributions. It was the main tool that we used. Most of the development in the neighborhood was assigned an amount of money, a per square foot contribution toward the parks that they needed to provide, so their pro rata share of the park's cost. The difference was on the block itself. We are actually hoping or planning to have the half of that block be privately redeveloped and half of the block be a park. And in that case, we're going to be contributing the development potential on the park to the developer of the remaining half of the block. So development potential will be used as a part of the financing of that park, yes.
Okay. Are actual tax land values used as existing land values?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And the answer is it depends, but generally no. Oftentimes, it's been my experience that the tax assessor's database doesn't really have what developers are willing to pay for land. It often is below that. So it's really a market-driven number. The question to ask is, what are developers paying per unit, per residential unit for land right now in this market, or per FAR foot for office space? Now, this is easier to do in places where there's a robust market, so there have been a lot of sales, so you have there's a track record. It gets much more challenging in a slower growth market where there just aren't that many sales, and sometimes you actually have to try to calculate the land value yourself by figuring out, how much can I afford to pay for land given the rents that I think I can get and my operating costs and my investment yield. But that's a little bit more difficult to do, but it isn't just looking at the property tax assessor's database.
Okay. In the White Flint example, did the public sector hire a counterpart to the developer's economic consultant to negotiate over all the numbers?
Yes, they actually had their own, they always are doing their own due diligence because ultimately this was a financing arrangement for infrastructure cost. So as I recall, yes, they had their own private consultant looking at financing alternatives. So it was a very interesting process because it was really an integrated process with the community, the public sector, i.e. Montgomery County, and the major landowners. So it was very dynamic. But yeah, everybody had everybody knew what was happening, and no one was able to pull the wool over anybody's eyes.
Great. Okay. Have any projects gone from start to completion in terms of actual tax revenue versus negotiated benefits from the developer in actual market demand rates?
Well, in Alexandria, the Braddock plan it's not 100% built out, but it's more than 50% built out. In the park is about 50%. We've acquired 50% of the park, and it's being improved right now. So I would say it's 50% of the way there. The other plans, we're still in the stages of early stages. In Potomac Yard, a lot of development has started in the southern end, but not at the northern end yet. We're still doing the environmental impact statement for the metro station. The plan was approved in 2010, so it wasn't that long ago. We really expect the Beauregard plan to be moving ahead. The developers, they just got their approvals last year, so they're still getting their final site plans and so forth. The landmark plan is still very early on, but the mall has submitted its plan for redevelopment and had it approved. So that one's I guess, still in the earliest of the stages of the 4 examples that I have. Sarah, maybe you know about White Flint.
Yeah, I mean, White Flint's moving forward, but I would like to say that Alexandria, every jurisdiction is a little bit different, and it's been my experience with Alexandria, Carl, that they often work with, developer contributions. If you go to Fairfax County, which is right next door in Virginia, very nearby, they don't like the idea of developer contributions because it's a very bumpy way to get money. They would much prefer more of the special assessment district concept where they can get a stream of money up front, and that allows them to be making public improvements from the very beginning. And I would say that in those cases where you can get the special assessment district, like a White Flint, like a Tyson's Corner, that the public sector has, your ability to move is enhanced a lot in the near term.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But it just depends upon it. They're all different about what different communities feel comfortable with. But I will say that the special assessment concept, it seems to me, if you can get it to happen, and the landowners agree that there's real benefit to infrastructure and public improvement investment, is a very clean way of getting near-term investment early.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's see. Do you have any advice regarding a code requirement to demonstrate need for a rezoning?
Oh, that's interesting. Flashing back to, I don't have that condition, and I was trying to flash back to a previous period in my career when we routinely had that requirement, and we had trouble with it every time. So,
and I know that I've dealt with this where, restaurants are like conditional uses, and you have to show and demonstrate that there's net new market to support restaurants and or liquor licenses and all of that, and it ends up we end up doing the study and they end up getting approved because there are all kinds of gymnastics one can do to make it happen. I think that the jurisdiction we used to do a lot of those kind of studies for, I think they stopped it.
Yeah, because right, I agree with you. We ended up equating market demand with need, and you can do that, but it's not necessarily what someone might mean by need, and we used to have a lot of debate about that with the community, because it would be much more convenient if the zoning ordinance would define what need meant, but typically it doesn't, so you end up having to come up with something, and usually it ended up being market demand, so this would help at least bound the conversation on how much market. Well, it's not really a market study, so I still think it's problematic. I try to get it out of your ordinance. Easy for me to say.
Okay. No other state than Virginia has a proffer system in exchange for rezoning. How can the techniques in Alexandria be transferable to other states?
Well, there's a couple things. One is through the special use permit avenue. which isn't strictly speaking through the rezoning mechanism. And I think a lot of jurisdictions do have a set of land uses which require special use permits of one kind or another that turn the decision from being sort of an administrative to a quasi-legislative decision, which gives you broader latitude to open that conversation to, well, what is the community getting out of it? What are the community impacts, and what are the compensating community benefits? I mean, even in Virginia, we are still talking about a voluntary contribution. However, in air quotes, that word voluntary may be. The other thing that I would say is that even when developer contributions are not part of the conversation, you may well be saying to a developer, well, using this information, you don't need that 3.0 FAR that you've been asking for. You're never going to use it, and you really only need 1.5 FAR in order to make your project work. So in that sense, you're benefiting the community by making your rezonings more rational and perhaps more limited than they would otherwise be.
And I would say that, you know, we basically have a whole practice based on this stuff, so it happens all over the country. And sometimes what triggers it isn't necessarily zoning, but a redevelopment wants to happen, particularly in urban environments, and it needs public money. And so, you know, it becomes a question of, does it really need public money? How much public money? What is a fair and equitable public-private arrangement? We use tax increment all over the country, which is really, you know, what is the value, what's the pacing of new development, what can the market support, so how can we then generate sufficient revenues to then pay for the infrastructure necessary to support growth. So I do agree that Virginia is so unique in the sense that you literally do almost negotiate development contributions, but all over the country, the public and the private sectors are working together to try to accomplish, you know, the visions of the communities, and often it requires them cooperating from a financing standpoint, and that means you have to understand the economics of the deal.
Okay. Are developers limited from seeking valuation reductions with the county assessor? We have had projects where large retailers seek reductions, thereby reducing available dollars for infrastructure debt payments. Do you prohibit developers or owners from seeking such property value reductions?
We've had
Go ahead.
Well, I've had an experience where we literally agree on what we think the TIF payment is, and the developer is obligated to pay that level of what would be the equal to what we thought the property tax would be, and to the extent that the property taxes are indeed that, we'll rebate them back. But if in fact the property taxes aren't that, the developer is on the hook to pay that each year. And it's a way of sort of protecting us from the downfall of tax increment, which is what happens if we projected it wrong. And so that's how we protect ourselves, is to require the developer to pay the amount and then use the increment to pay them back. And if the increment isn't sufficient, that's their problem, not ours.
Yeah, and I don't think we've done anything specifically to prohibit them from pursuing a lower value.
Well, I actually had an experience. I wasn't directly involved, but I was working in the city when a developer did try to get their property taxes reduced, and there was a big court case, and in fact it came down on the side of the property owner, the developer, because they said, you know, you can't force someone to pay property taxes that are more than what the property is worth. But the example I used beforehand, which is there's an agreement that they're going to pay a certain amount in lieu of property taxes, you don't have that problem. I mean, they have to pay this amount, and if the property taxes are there, they are. If they're not, they're not.
That's very good. Good idea.
Okay. Is the TIF the primary special assessment vehicle used, Or are there others?
Well, in Alexandria, we have liked them. So I would say that answers yes for us in the most recent past. And it's not a formal TIF. It's more an agreement by the city council to that we are going to divert some fraction of the additional increment toward the infrastructure and amenities that are called for in the plan. And so far we have done that. But we have stopped short of setting up a specific tax increment financing district. We have created, though, a special assessment district in the one case, and that is the Potomac Yard for the metro station, where the stakes are considerably higher, that we make sure we get all of the contribution we are expecting in order to make that station work.
So to me, a special assessment is different than tax increment. Mm-hmm. Tax increment is taking what is the city's money, which is the property taxes, and driving those incremental increase in property taxes back into the project to fund amenities, infrastructure, etc. It's essentially the city's money. A special assessment is an extra tax that the property owners pay, so it's their money. So when I use the example of White Flint, I mean, I think it was like they paid 10% of their property tax bill, and they increased their property tax bill by 10% and used that additional 10% as a special assessment that they charged all the property owners pay it, and that goes into a bucket that is paid, that then goes to pay for infrastructure. So it is a net new tax on top of them. That's how Dulles Rail was funded in Tysons. The property owners are paying an additional tax up and above the property taxes to help fund those infrastructure improvements. So in my mind, when I think special assessment, I think it's the private sector's money. When I think tax increment, even though it's driven by the new project, we're using what the city would have gotten from the project to drive it back into the infrastructure, if that makes
Going along with this, there's a question here. Would it be legal to assess impact fees, developer contributions for only a specific area of the city? And then the question goes on, would this be done with the special assessment district or some other mechanism?
Well, impact tax is a way of getting upfront developer contributions. Typically, the impact tax is paid upfront or before the certificate of occupancies are issued. And the difference really is that impact taxes are typically a formula that you come up with the anticipated cost for an area. It can be a sub-area of a city or a jurisdiction, or the entire jurisdiction. But you calculate the what you need to collect in order to make the necessary improvements or infrastructure expenditures, and divide it more usually on a pro rata share among the anticipated development, and then each development project that comes in pays that impact fee or impact tax depending on the jurisdiction. And so I would say that sort of the difference here is that we're doing it on a more customized basis, but the same analysis could have been used. We could have come up with an impact tax, say, for Beauregard as the means of collecting the developer contribution that we calculated using this approach.
Okay, we have another proffer question. Have either of you worked with developers that are seeking cash proffer credits for high-quality building materials in lieu of a cash proffer payment? If so, how do you evaluate the value of high-quality building materials architectural proffers?
I would say we do have a discussion of the added value of high-quality architecture. It is something that Alexandria spends enormous. prizes very highly, and so it is definitely part of almost every conversation that we have with a developer, and it is an element of most development projects. In general, it would be to the extent we can value it, and that we agree that it's an extra cost, because in part we think that developers should know by now that Alexandria has a certain expectation for architectural quality, in part because we have a number of historic districts, and that has its own, that drives its own expenditures in terms of architecture, but also because it's been part of our practice for so long. If we can come to an agreement on the additional cost of the materials that are being used, and we can come to an agreement on which of those are quote-unquote extra, things that Alexandria wanted that they could have been just as successful without providing, then we could work that into the bucket list. And that's, I think, how we would do it. We are pretty aware here of, on staff, of just how much architectural materials cost and how much an extra cost certain elements are. So we would be able to work that through if we needed to.
And to the extent that we have a specific project and we're trying to calculate the equitable arrangement between the public and the private, we would actually, you know, understand those development costs, and we'd solve in light of those development costs with the enhanced materials.
Right.
But I can't say I've had much experience with the issue coming in that I won't pay the normal $10 a square foot. I only want to pay $8 because I'm doing a gold-plated building.
Right.
We haven't had that much in our experience.
Okay, just a few more questions. Are you guys okay with doing
Sure.
just a few more? Okay. How does Alexandria determine whether it needs a new fire station? Are the standards based on proximity or intensity of land use? How do you show the connection between the new development and the need for new development?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, we do response times. We have using a GIS, the forecast of new development. We include the forecast of development at 5 stories or less and 5 stories and above. I think that's the right break for different kinds of trucks. In the case, and we do that, we have done that calculation, and in fact we're in the middle of redoing it because of the additional fire station beyond the one I mentioned in Beauregard. In the case of Beauregard, it was a little easier for us to do that because something like 75 to 90% of the calls answered in that part of town were being answered by Fairfax County because Alexandria routinely was unable to get to the call first. So we had, that was the data that I think was most convincing to the community and to the city council to justify the need for the additional fire station. But response times would be another one that we would that we are using.
Okay, let's see. Are any of these projects addressing impacts in adjacent communities?
The Alexandria examples are not. Not through this mechanism, at least. Now, in the case of Beauregard, there was considerable discussion during the planning process about the impacts on neighboring jurisdictions, and the citizens that live outside Alexandria but in Fairfax County were fairly vocal participants in the planning process. The main way that came out in sort of a practical purpose was that we included impacts on intersections in neighboring jurisdictions in the traffic analysis, and so the solutions were ones that would bring the intersection standards to acceptable, kept it acceptable in the neighboring jurisdictions. So to a limited extent, the transportation improvements that we approved benefited the neighboring jurisdictions from that perspective. So it's sort of in a backwards way. It is reflected in the developer contribution because part of that developer contribution goes toward that transportation improvement that does help benefit the neighboring jurisdiction in that sense.
Okay, great. For mixed uses, are the fees different per square foot?
I'll let Sarah jump in after I finish. I believe we have not been assessing the payments on a per square foot basis different by use. The different uses go into the equation at a different time. They go in at the beginning when Sarah's calculating the value that's created. That the value that's created differs depending on the mix of uses. But then we don't go back and say for every retail square footage you need to contribute $10 and for every office square footage you need to contribute 12 or something like that. We haven't done it that way.
That's correct, but when we're doing the calculations, we do, as you recall, if you saw the slide on North Potomac Yard, we had retail, residential, and office, and we had different land values for each one of those. So that kind of goes into the equation, but then we generally come out with just sort of a range of what are likely benefits to the private sector, and then everything gets pretty generalized in policy, as Carl just explained. But it also really depends upon the location, because sometimes municipalities force mixed use, and it really works in certain locations, and in other locations, the ground floor that's forced to be retail, the upper floors are subsidizing the retail, so the retail's value may actually even be negative. So we do take it into consideration in our analytic process.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, that wraps up the Q&A. Do you guys have any other final thoughts or final comments before I close up shop here?
No, but thank you very much for having us.
Sure,
Thank you.
absolutely. Yeah, and for those still in attendance, just to remind you again, you can log your CM credits probably in about a week or so. It's still CM pending. And again, we are recording the webcasts, and it'll be available on our YouTube channel by searching Planning Webcast. So this concludes today's session. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and thank you, Margaret, if you're still hanging on there. She's on the Executive Committee for the Urban Design and Preservation Division. Thanks for coordinating our speakers and getting this going today. And thank you to our speakers, Carl and Sarah. This was great. It's a heavy topic, and you fielded it well. So thanks, everybody, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.